If you think the government only cares about taxing what you earn, then you are looking at the scoreboard and missing the direction of the game. The next fight is not only about income, it is about visible wealth. And for most ordinary families, the most visible wealth they have is not in a hedge fund, not in a private company, not in some complicated trust structure hidden behind a dozen lawyers. It is sitting in the walls of the house. That is the line I want you to hold in your mind while I talk to you, because once you see it clearly, a great deal of what looks like disconnected tax policy starts fitting together into one very simple machine. Governments are moving from taxing the stream to studying the reservoir, from taxing what you earn every year to asking what you already own, what has appreciated, what is sitting there, what is easy to value, what is politically tempting, and what looks inactive enough to be called available. That is the real shift people argue about labels, because labels keep the public confused. Surtax, fairness tax, mansion tax, wealth tax, special assessment, property reassessment, exit tax, net worth tax, supplemental levy, different words, same instinct. The state looks for assets that are already visible, already priced, already sitting still, and therefore easier to reach. That is why home equity matters so much. Home equity looks harmless to the family that built it. It looks irresistible to a government that cannot stop spending. A salary moves, a business profit can disappear, market values fluctuate, but a house is local, visible, accessible, politically convenient, and emotionally difficult for the owner to move quickly. That makes it exactly the kind of target governments prefer, not because they hate houses, because houses do not run away easily. That is the mother line. They are not really taxing the house. They are studying stillness, and still wealth is the easiest wealth to politically surround. Now let me say something very clearly. I am not telling you that every politician in America is about to wake up tomorrow and attach a giant new national tax directly to your front door. The process is subtler than that. It starts in layers. First, higher taxes on high earners, then special surtaxes at certain thresholds, then one-time levies sold as emergency fairness, then property assessments that climb more aggressively than your income does, then taxes discussed not on what you sold, but on what you merely held. Then a conversation begins about unrealized gain, ability to pay, public need, undertaxed wealth, idle appreciation, social responsibility, and all the rest of the language used when the state wants a bigger claim on something you thought was already yours. That is how these things move. Not in one leap. In a staircase. And the mistake ordinary people make is thinking the top stair is only for billionaires. That is how they get caught sleeping on the lower ones. A billionaire is useful politically because he makes the first argument emotionally easy. Tax him. He has too much. Fine. But once the machinery, the databases, the formulas, and the constitutional logic are all built, the machine does not stay politely contained forever. Governments under pressure do not construct a beautiful new taxing engine and then leave it idling after the first lap. They look for the next base, the next class, the next asset pool, the next easier target, and eventually the easiest visible target in the entire middle and upper middle part of society is home equity. Why? Because they already know where it is. That matters more than people realize. The county knows the address. The state knows the owner. The assessor already has a value on file. The mortgage balance is discoverable. The public records connect the pieces. The data architecture is not hypothetical. It already exists. In many counties now, property valuation is not even a sleepy bureaucratic estimate anymore. It is updated by aerial images, scanning systems, comparable sale engines, and a level of digital visibility that previous generations never had to imagine. Your property is not merely on the map. It is in the machine. That is why I say again, the issue is not only the law. The issue is the infrastructure of valuation. Once the government can see the reservoir clearly enough, the temptation to tax stillness grows rapidly. And I want to say something that sounds simple but is actually profound. A tax does not become dangerous when it passes. It becomes dangerous when the asset base is fixed. That is the sentence people miss. They think the threat begins on the day the bill is signed. Often the real threat begins on the valuation date, the assessment date, the ownership date, the residency date, or the look-back window written quietly into the law. By the time the public fully notices, the trap may already be measuring them. That is why preparedness beats outrage every single time. The rich understand this instinctively. People mock them for moving. People mock them for using trusts. People mock them for borrowing against assets instead of owning them clean. People mock them for converting equity into productive structures. Then the rule changes, and suddenly what looked paranoid becomes obvious. I have never been impressed by post-fact outrage. I am much more impressed by pre-fact positioning. So let us talk about the first real line of defense, jurisdiction. If a state becomes openly hostile to capital, to ownership, to high-income earners, or to visible wealth, then the first adult question is not, can I endure this a little longer? The first adult question is, why am I volunteering to remain an easy target? I understand that moving is not easy. Family, work, school, inertia, emotion, attachment, all of it is real. But capital has always voted with its feet, long before the average citizen admits the room is getting hot. The people with the best information and the most to lose rarely wait around for the final policy memo. They read the direction, they move before the crowd. That is not cowardice. That is asset protection. But let us assume moving is not realistic, at least not right now. Then the next principle matters even more. Separation. Most people hold the title to their largest asset in the simplest, most nakedly visible form possible. Their personal name on the deed. Full visibility, full direct linkage, full easy mapping between person, address, asset, and public valuation. That is convenient until convenience becomes the enemy, because a state that wants to tax visible personal net worth starts with visible personal net worth. This is where structure enters the conversation. Trusts, LLCs, layering, proper estate architecture, proper legal wrappers. I am not telling anyone to break the law or pretend an asset does not exist. I am saying something more basic. There is a difference between owning an asset and displaying it in the easiest possible form for future extraction. The prepared person understands that difference. The unprepared person calls it unnecessary until the day he wishes he had done it earlier. Governments and tax boards do not love complexity when the complexity slows their first sweep. The first sweep always matters, because early sorting is where friction can buy you time, options, and defenses. If the machine can instantly connect your name, your deed, your assessed value, your mortgage file, and your net worth estimate, then you are exactly the kind of clean target modern systems love. That is why structure matters, not because it makes you invisible, because it prevents you from being easy. The next principle is leverage. And this is where people with a consumer mindset get confused. They think a paid-off house is pure safety. Emotionally, I understand that. Strategically, it can be a sitting duck. A paid-off home with large visible equity is a perfect trophy for a future tax designer. The equity is there. It is unencumbered. It is static. It is emotionally anchored. The owner does not want to sell. The owner often cannot move quickly. That makes it a beautiful target. What looks like prudence to the homeowner can look like idle taxable capacity to the state. This is why I say over and over that debt and risk are not the same thing. Bad debt is dangerous. Cheap strategic debt can be camouflage, a home equity line, a properly structured mortgage, a balance sheet design that reduces the appearance of dead equity sitting passively. All of these change the conversation. The point is not to recklessly lever your house because leverage sounds smart. The point is to understand that unstructured visible equity is not the fortress many people imagine it to be. It is in some cases a billboard, and if you can lawfully reduce the size of that billboard, you should at least understand the option. That leads to another principle many people ignore because it sounds too mundane. Challenge the number. Government math hardens when nobody disputes it. That is true in taxes. It is true in regulation. It is true in property valuation. Most people treat the assessed value on their property bill as if it came down from a mountain. It did not. It came from a system, and systems are often lazy, crude, slow, and biased toward their own revenue interests. A number that goes unchallenged becomes real through inertia, not truth. And if a new tax ever uses that number as a base, then your failure to challenge it today becomes a compounded mistake tomorrow. I have always believed that the most expensive number in your financial life is often the one you accepted without checking. If the county says your house is worth more than it truly is for tax purposes, then every year you let that ride, you are quietly financing their optimism. If a future levy, surcharge, or equity-style formula sits on top of that same number, the cost compounds. That is why smart owners fight the base before the bigger tax even exists. You do not wait for the new layer. You start with the foundation. Now we come to one of the most underappreciated protections in all of personal finance. Frozen growth, homestead caps, assessment caps, constitutional limits, annual growth limits on taxable assessed value. These are boring, procedural, and politically unsexy, which is precisely why they matter so much. Boring rules often save more money than exciting arguments. If your market value is exploding but your taxable base is capped, that gap is not just a curiosity, it is a shield, but shields only work if they are active. A surprising number of people either never file for the protections available to them or assume the protection stayed intact when some administrative detail broke it. That is how people lose free defenses through laziness. The state loves lazy owners. Lazy owners make taxation frictionless. I prefer friction. Friction buys time. Friction buys optionality. Friction buys negotiating room. The next principle is conversion. A great deal of wealth remains vulnerable because it is held in the least strategic form possible. Raw, visible, personally held, non-productive equity. The better question is whether that equity can be converted into something with a different taxable profile, a different income profile, a different legal wrapper, or a different balance sheet function. Productive real estate, leveraged real estate, entities with offsetting debt, structures that generate depreciation, assets that produce cash flow rather than merely sit there waiting to be politically rediscovered. This is one of the oldest truths in wealth management. Productive wealth is treated differently than sleeping wealth. The state likes sleeping wealth because it seems socially available. It tolerates productive wealth because productive wealth can still be defended as working. That may not be philosophically pure, but philosophy is not the game board here. Incentives are. And once you understand the incentives, you stop treating your house as a sacred emotional object and start treating it as a balance sheet component that may require intelligent positioning long before anyone on television says the problem has arrived. That is what adults do with capital. They do not merely admire it, they position it. Now, I want to address the emotional resistance here because it is very real. A lot of people hear a discussion like this and think it sounds dramatic, paranoid, or overly tactical. I understand the reaction. Most people want to believe their home is simply a place to live, not a future battlefield between private savings and public need. Unfortunately, those two things can coexist. The same house can be your home and a politically legible asset. The same equity can feel invisible to you and obvious to a government desperate for revenue. The same family that says, "We are nowhere near billionaire wealth," can still be standing on exactly the sort of highly visible reservoir that lower-level policy experimentation eventually moves toward. That is how taxation politics works. The rhetoric starts at the top because that is where resistance is weakest. The machinery spreads downward because that is where the volume is. People do not like hearing that. They like it even less when it turns out to be true. So what would I do? First, I would stop thinking only in terms of income tax and start thinking in terms of visibility tax. I would review the jurisdiction I am in with adult eyes, not sentimental ones. Third, I would make sure my deed, entity structure, and family legal architecture are not naive. Fourth, I would understand the current assessed value, the challenge process, and every cap or freeze available to me. Fifth, I would think hard about whether idle equity should remain idle and naked or become structured, leveraged, or converted into something more strategically useful. Sixth, I would do all of that before any final policy fight reaches its emotional climax, because by then the dates that matter may already have passed. That last point is everything. The state rarely tells you the last safe day in advance. You discover it afterward, and by then you are no longer planning, you are reacting. I do not like reactive capital. Reactive capital is frightened capital. Reactive capital makes rushed decisions, bad decisions, expensive decisions, and legally clumsy decisions. The people who preserve wealth through changing rules are almost always the ones who acted before acting felt necessary. That is why this subject matters. Not because I can promise you the exact form of the next levy, or the exact state that goes first, or the exact wording politicians will use to make it sound noble. The exact wording does not matter, the direction matters, and the direction is clear enough. The state is becoming more comfortable taxing what sits, more comfortable measuring what appreciates without selling, more comfortable calling visible private reservoirs socially available, more comfortable using fairness language to wrap extraction, that is the road. And once you see the road, you do not stand in the middle of it and argue about the precise paint color of the truck coming toward you. You step aside. That is the whole lesson. Your home equity may feel passive to the state. Passive is the point, and the families who understand that first will not be the ones desperately learning too late that still wealth is the easiest wealth to target.